development industry, ranging from client-side advisory services, green building rating tool consultancy, and an on-site head of sustainability for a major international contractor. Victoria brings a combination of technical and strategic expertise to the program. She has a degree in architecture and environmental design from the University of Nottingham and co-authored the book System Approach to High Performance Green Buildings. This evening, we're going to welcome Victoria Burrows from the World GBC. Thank you. You can take on your session, Victoria.
Thank you, Olayemi. I don't seem to be able to start my video. I'm not sure if someone can help me with that. But in the meantime, I can get started with my presentation. I hope that's okay. And hopefully you'll be able to magically see me at some part. So hi there. Yes, my name is Victoria Burrows. I am indeed the Director of Advancing Net Zero at the World Green Building Council. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to the Green Building Council in Nigeria for inviting me here today to share a little bit with you about the program at the World GBC and what we're working on and how you can be a part of it. So firstly, a little bit about World GBC as an overview. Some of you may be aware that the Green Building Council of Nigeria is one of our members. We have around 77 national green building councils all over the world as part of the World GBC membership. And we are working towards systemic change that we need from the entire building and construction sector right across the built environment value chain. And we focus on 3 critical impact areas, which are climate action, resources and circularity, and health, well-being, and social equity. Against each of these impact areas, we have a mission and a goal that we're working towards. And for our climate action goal, that talks about how new buildings, infrastructure and renovations will have 40% less embodied carbon with significant upfront carbon reduction, and all new buildings are net zero operational carbon. And that's against a total goal of total sector decarbonisation by 2050. And that's where advancing net zero comes in. It is a global campaign to accelerate our sector towards total sector decarbonisation by 2050. And we do that by increasing awareness and education of the urgency and the achievability of net zero carbon buildings. We're working to achieve alignment and commonality between GBC approaches and certification schemes, and to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples at events like the one we have here today, but also right through the year and all across the world. I'll start with a couple of definitions, and I know I don't have a huge amount of time, so I'm happy to go into this in more detail a little later. But the way that we define net zero buildings is that you start with the baseline. So how would that building be either performing? How would you expect that building to be performing based on the way that the building is going to be designed, if it was designed to the current code requirements, or the way that it's currently performing if it's an existing building? We can implement energy efficiency measures to reduce demand, and that would make your building energy efficient. The way that you then supply your building with renewable energy then helps set which definition or which terminology around the zero carbon buildings agenda that you can apply. So for example, you could have some on-site renewable energy to your building, and it might not meet the full demand that's left after those energy efficiency measures, and your building would be nearly net zero energy. So some of its use is from renewable energy, some of it from non-renewable energy sources. If you meet all of your building's requirements with on-site renewable energy, 100%, that means your building is zero energy. But of course, that's incredibly dependent on the size of your building, where it's located, if you can physically fit enough solar panels on that building to power the building. And of course, that building would have to be incredibly energy efficient. And then energy positive means that you generate more than 100% of on-site renewable energy. Maybe that helps balance out through the year and you store that in batteries, or maybe you share that with your neighboring buildings. But we know that that's not possible in every building across the world. And that's why we focus on the term carbon, net zero carbon, which means that So you could supply some of your energy requirements from on-site renewable energy, but that the balance, or indeed maybe 100% of your energy, is met by off-site renewable energy generation from solar farms or wind farms, and that could be delivered through the grid, or it could be through power purchase agreements or renewable energy certificates. And so we call that net zero operational carbon, covering the emissions associated with the use of the building. And then we have the need to reduce embodied carbon as well. So that's the embodied carbon comes from the materials and construction processes that go into creating the building in the first place. And again, the same principle applies: reduce embodied carbon to the minimum that's necessary in order to continue to build that building. If you're then able to compensate for any residual emissions that come from either the operational carbon, maybe you're still connected to a fossil fuel grid, or maybe you have on-site diesel generators or gas boilers, even gas cookers, you can compensate for those residual emissions through high quality offset schemes. And that would mean that your building is net zero whole life carbon when you also include the embodied carbon within those calculations. So that's a very quick tour through the terms that we use, and hopefully that will help frame some of the things that I'm about to share with you. So our Advancing Net Zero Whole Life Carbon mission and vision is based on a set of principles. Firstly, for operational carbon, reduce and optimize energy demand, then generate the balance of that energy demand from renewable energy, then compensate for any residual emissions, and then finally plan for deep decarbonization. For embodied carbon, the same goes: prevent first, reduce your carbon first, and maybe that's through prioritizing the use of renovating an existing building instead of building a new one, for example. You reduce and optimize your embodied carbon through your design choices, fossil fuel-free construction, or thinking about lean construction, and then the sorts of materials that go into the building. Planning for the future, so thinking about how you can optimize a building to be renovated in the future, reconfigured internally so you don't have to move building, it's easier to use and extend the useful life. And how can you deconstruct that building so that you can use the materials all over again? And then finally, again, compensating for residual emissions. I've mentioned our 2030 and 2050 dates already. We need to see all buildings as net zero, including existing buildings, by 2050. And that has a huge implication in the way that we design our buildings, the way we use them, the way we build them, and the supply chain as well. And we need to see for new buildings where we have a greater opportunity to influence the way they're designed and built, that those are net zero from 2030. And that's just sort of 7 to 8 very short years away. And in design terms of new buildings, that's just around the corner. So we have introduced a leadership track that's called the Net Zero Carbon Buildings Commitment, and businesses and organizations commit through this commitment to achieving the 2050 dates by 2030. So that means that in their existing buildings, they're eliminating all their emissions and compensating with offsets, and that new developments are achieving maximum reductions in embodied carbon and also compensating residual emissions through those high quality offsets. And that through their business activities, they are advocating for all buildings to be net zero whole life carbon by 2050. So for example, you're a design firm, the commitment covers the offices that you occupy, but then you're also presenting and using and channeling those concepts through the design work that you do as a firm. And that's really important because that's helping us understand what are the business models, the design approaches, the tools, the technologies, the materials, the innovation, the technologies. What do we need in order to get from where we are now to that 2050 goal? And part of that agenda is the Green Building Councils. And we have GBCs from all our 5 regions of the world who are developing the sorts of guidance and tools and frameworks that can help you understand what net zero means for your market, and help you in some cases be able to verify that through rating tools. With an Africa focus for a moment, we launched last year a manifesto for sustainable cities and built environments, launched just before COP27 in Egypt. And it sets out immediately actionable policy asks but also actions that businesses can take across a range of issues, including, of course, energy and carbon, but also extending to the more holistic approach that we mean when we talk about sustainable built environments. And keep an eye out for more coming from our announcement at COP27 around the African Alliance, which is intended to support MSMEs in understanding what net zero means and how they can support in delivering more sustainable built environments across the African continent. So please join us in leading the transition to a sustainable and decarbonized built environment for everyone, everywhere. And I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. That was a very wonderful introduction that you had there, telling us what the World GBC is doing concerning carbon and how, all of the steps and parts and features of the entire process has been broken down, bringing the African Manifesto on board. Also, I believe we had a session last year, also with our GBCs and our members here in Nigeria around the African Manifesto and what needs to be done. And I believe that we are all working together to ensure that the 1.3 billion people in Africa are living within safe environment and also addressing the issues of the global climate crisis. Thank you once again for that wonderful session. So next, we will just quickly go on to our next discuss. Of course, anyone who has questions for Victoria can drop it in the chat box. We'll take it during the Q&A session. For the next 10 minutes as well, we want to quickly discuss about EDGE. EDGE is a tool, is a green building rating tool that has been developed by the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. So the next session we'll be taking now would revolves around EDGE as a tool for decarbonizing the built environment. And to take that session, we have with us here Mr. Dennis Papa Olayemi. I'll just take a brief introduction and then it would take on the discuss for the next 10 minutes. Dennis Papa Olayemi is a green building lead at the IFC, where he leads the IFC EDGE Green Building Market Transformation Program in Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria, and serves as a support for the African sub-region. He works with IFC's global partners in green building certifications and is responsible for identifying early EDGE adopters amongst commercial and residential developers, financial institutions, industry organizations, and other stakeholders, presenting the technical and business case for EDGE and assisting in registering projects for EDGE certifications. Mr. Kwanzaa works with national and lead governments to ensure EDGE is incorporated into incentives and policy planning and to assist governments to create green building codes. He has a background in urban development with experience in the built environment in Africa and has participated in several redevelopment projects. He has, over the last 10 years, provided specific technical inputs for various real estate projects. He has expertise in the area of sustainable real estate development, real estate marketing and agency, real estate development management, real estate valuation and business development. He has also undertaken social economic surveys aimed at profiling project affected persons, acronym PAPS, for property impact assessments for compensation and supplementary assistance. He holds an MSc in urban policy and development from the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK, an undergraduate degree in land economy from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. He's a member of the Ghana Institute of Surveyors. Please welcome Mr. Dennis Papa Olayemi. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So, as you rightly said, this session would look at how we can use EDGE as a tool for decarbonization within the built environment. I would want to start off with a little background. What we see, I mean, from this slide, we see that many of the green options actually do not cost as much as it used to be in the past. This slide is actually a popular graphic from McKinsey, and it shows the decarbonization potential of different options compared to their costs. And you'd realize that, I mean, the cost of carbon abatement is on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis, you see the carbon emission reduction potential. The options on the left are the cheapest, and their cost is actually negative. And that is precisely where you would find a lot of the green building options. Most of the green building options that you see in the slide would actually make you money. And this is how IFC has been able to invest about 7.6 billion USD in green buildings. And from our experience, we've seen that the incremental cost of these investments is actually between 0 to 3%, and you are able to get a payback within 3 years. Here you're able to see, so there is the path to net zero, which Ms. Burrows talked about in her presentation. The target, as she did mention, was by 2030, all new buildings need to achieve zero carbon in operations. And by 2050, all buildings, both new and old, need to achieve the zero carbon. Now, how are we going to do that? What we've seen is that on this particular part, I mean, between 2030 to 2050, we really need to set some targets for developers and then for building owners on how they can decarbonize their portfolio. For us, the first step should be to map the entire existing building portfolio within EDGE, and we will look at how that will be done. This will give you, or I mean, give the developer, the building owners, a clear information on their current DAG emissions, and then also the entire portfolio's carbon footprint. Then you are able to plan for doing the necessary retrofits that would be needed to be done so that it can comply for the EDGE certification. And then the second step that one would be able to do would be to set clear certification targets. We think that building owners should be able to plan to bring their building portfolio to become compliant first. And then they also need to make sure that the new and existing buildings can comply with at least the basic air certification system. So this would mean that each building would be should be saving at least 20% on energy, 20% on water, and 20% in embodied energy in materials. And this is for both new and existing building. And then thirdly, building owners should be able to plan to transition the entire portfolio to achieve the EDGE Advanced certification, which is 40% savings on energy as a minimum. This will now allow them to qualify for EDGE zero carbon certification in the future. Right, they would now be able to plan out their reporting strategy to inform the, investors and shareholders of their progress. It will be possible for them to now access sustainability-linked bonds and other green finance products that are available. Let's look at EDGE in general. So I did talk about the standards. EDGE basically includes a free software. It's a very rigorous but streamlined standard that looks at least 20% reduction in operational energy, operational water, and the embodied energy in materials. And it compares this to a local baseline, right? It also has a certification system which is administered through a very large network of green building certifiers in the world, but then the quality control is done by the IFC. Now, the interesting thing with the software is that it's able to get you to make decisions as quickly as possible. The interface is easy to be used even by a CFO who has no idea on buildings. He's able to figure out a rough financial cost and benefit of the certification in a few minutes. Secondly, architects can also work with the software even before they have a design to choose what set of green design options would be needed in their project. And this is very important because when green measures are incorporated very early in the project, you are able to reduce the extra cost of going green. And then the third advantage of this software is that as the green measures are selected, their cost and payback in utility bills is calculated immediately. So it's able to give you an idea of which passive measures can be used in there. You're also able to compare the cheapest options that would give you the best savings. And then lastly, I also want to say that the software, it incorporates instant energy modeling with a cost and benefit database so that you're able to make a commercial decision immediately. This is how the certificate looks like. It's able to display the key financial indicators upfront. So you would have a single document that provides the proof of compliance, as well as also fulfilling whatever reporting needs that you may have. On the slide, on the certificate, you can see what the percentage operational savings of the energy would be, what the savings in water is, the percentage reduction in embodied energy materials is. You can see the building's carbon footprint, and then even the expected savings in emission. Now, we've seen that EDGE has grown very quickly, mainly because it takes the box for all the major green finance standards. So once it's used and utilized, you are able to assess these financial requirements wherever they are available. So once the project is entered in the software, the designer can easily see what it takes to get EDGE certified. And you can either get EDGE certified, go EDGE advanced, or the last bit being zero carbon. Now, how do we really achieve the zero carbon certification? We see that it is possible with some very simple and sensible steps, and also by choosing your energy sources carefully. So we do have a client in the Philippines called NIU. They were able to certify their entire portfolio zero carbon by, first of all, reducing their energy consumption by 45%. And then they offsetted their energy with zero carbon hydroelectric power. But how does it really look like within EDGE? So this slide would help provide some more explanation, right? There are a lot of options when you're looking at zero carbon certification using EDGE. The first and most important step would be to reduce your building's energy consumptions by implementing passive measures. Example of this could be having reduced window to wall ratio, insulation of your external walls, insulation of your roof and floors, incorporating energy efficient lighting, and then, most importantly, making sure you have a correct orientation. Now, so these measures are not only they are not the most expensive ones. They are very, very cheap. And then also when it comes to implementation, it is very, very effective. Secondly, secondly, you can also now look at the more active measures. For example, having efficient heating or cooling, putting in place lighting controls, putting in place efficient boilers, and then more. This may be a bit more expensive, but are also very effective at reducing energy usage. So we would, I mean, you would have some clients who would also want to install some stuff such as efficient dishwasher. So we'll be looking at the machinery that is even put in there. You would have to now look at all of that. Now, the last bit, so by doing all of this, you would have been able to achieve the second level of EDGE, which is EDGE Advanced. And now the client can choose the source of energy for their building from a renewable source, that if it's available. So these resources include having the hydroelectric power plant, just like our clients Neo did. Or you could also look at offshore and onshore wind power. You could look at solar PVs. I mean, solar PVs is the most popular ones in our part of the world. And then you can, I mean, in place of having the renewables to top up to the 100%, you could also look at carbon credits as an option to offset the remaining emissions, right? And carbon credits are actually available worldwide. So this is also an option that one could look at if you do not have access to renewable energy sources for that particular project. Right, so that would now be able to push the project to 100%. I mean, basically, this would be done very easily and simply within the EDGE software. At the moment, we have close to about 12 projects globally that have been able to achieve the zero carbon certification. I mean, unfortunately, none of it is in Africa. So we are working very closely with our clients that have already achieved the second step of EDGE, which is the EDGE Advanced, and then guiding them so they can be able to achieve the zero carbon certification. So very soon we should be able to see some projects on the continent also being able to achieve the zero carbon certification. So yeah, I would end my slides, my presentation with this slide. We do have our EDGE Zero Carbon Pledge wall, which has a lot of our clients pledging that gradually they are going to go net zero by 2030. So they are taking their time by, first of all, reaching the EDGE Advanced status, and then slowly making sure they incorporate renewables or plan to offset their carbon in order to reach that. Okay, thanks so much. I'll hand over to you. I think you're on mute, so we cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much, Mr. Kwanzaa, for that wonderful and brilliant presentation on the EDGE software. For those that are not familiar, so the EDGE software by the IFC, which basically measures a lot of design efficiencies, like Mr. Kwanzaa had mentioned, it talked about materials, it talked about energy, so the platform is particularly useful for designers. So I'm glad that we're having this session because, I know we have a lot of designers in the house, we have a lot of professionals, people who work every day, in terms of design, the entire process. And, this is the software that when you really analyze the building, you're able to see what the potential carbon, footprints of your materials are on your building, the efficiencies that you're able to achieve. And, like you also had mentioned, I'm particularly impressed that, they already have an advanced stage of certification, which is the level 3 that looks at zero carbon. I believe that even without doing that, right from the design stage, we already have low-hanging fruits that we can begin to tap into right from the point of design, where you can begin to see, okay, how do I reduce my energy consumption? How do I make my building more efficient? Cost savings, tracking, management, and all that. So I'm sure we all have a lot of questions to ask on this session. Without taking much of our time, thank you again, Mr. Kwanzaa, for that brilliant presentation. We'll go on to the third presentation that we have today, which is more of like a case study. When Mr. Kwanzaa was presenting, he had a case study. He took us the Brazil, and we have with us this evening with us on the role of carbon data in decarbonizing the built environment, and the Brazilian perspective. I'm just going to take a quick introduction of Fernanda, and then she would take on a session. So Fernanda is a civil engineer and has a PhD from the University of Sao Paulo, and works as a researcher at the Institute of Technological Research in Sao Paulo, Brazil, with research stays at the Fraunhofer Institute of Building Physics in Germany and at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. The focus of Fernanda's work is particularly in assessing the environmental performance of construction products and systems based on the life cycle approach. She has coordinated the development of the Brazilian database of environmental performance indicators for construction products called CDAC. She has also coordinated the development of national life cycle inventories of Brazilian construction products supported to the international LCA database EcoInvent. Just before Fernanda comes on board, please drop your questions. For those who are asking this session, the recording of this session will be shared with everyone who has registered for the webinar. Also, I believe that the speakers would share their slides so that we can all go through. But when it comes to the reality of what we deal with day to day as a Nigerian built environment professional, I believe we should really take and listen keenly at Fernanda's presentation, because she's done something with products, so we can begin to look at different products as they relate to us. So you're welcome, Fernanda Silva, to take your session. Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me to share our experience here in Brazil. It's a great pleasure to present it to you. I will just share my screen. Please just confirm if you're seeing my presentation. Is it okay?
Yes, it is.
So, as I've already been introduced, let's go straight to the point. What's the importance of talking about embodied carbon here in Brazil? This is a picture of a typical Brazilian building, a typical Brazilian house. And we have conducted a life cycle assessment of this building, considering the whole life cycle and 50 years of service life. And you can see that 61% of the carbon emissions are due to the materials production. So they happen just at the beginning. And unlike European or North American buildings, we do not need to heat the buildings here in Brazil. And our electricity is predominantly from renewable sources. So if we are talking about decarbonizing the construction industry here, we have to look at the embodied carbon. And why did we decide to develop our own database of construction products instead of working with foreign emission factors and going straight to the building level? Because it makes a huge difference between using primary data and secondary data from these foreign databases. This is the relative difference between the CO2 emissions of construction products calculated using primary data and using secondary data from foreign databases. So you can see that in some cases, the carbon footprint doubles if we use secondary data. And in some cases, our materials are more impactful than the foreign ones. So this means that using foreign data could guide us to wrong decisions. And that's why we chose to develop our own local database. So our database is called SIDAC. It's the acronym in Portuguese for Information System for Environmental Performance in Construction. It's a web-based system for calculating and disclosing environmental performance indicators for construction products. It's based on the life cycle approach, but it's meant to be accessible to people who are not experts in LCA, which are most of our construction professionals. And if we consider the presentation that Victoria did about the urgency to reduce carbon emissions in the sector, we cannot wait until everybody becomes an LCA specialist. So that's why we made it user-friendly. So the scope covered in this first version of the database is from the extraction of raw materials from nature to the factory gate. So it's cradle to gate. And we covered 2 indicators for now, which is the primary energy demand and the CO2 emission, which are also known as embodied energy and embodied carbon of the materials. In the future, we can extend the scope to cover other indicators like water consumption or material footprint. And the system has several functionalities. So to calculate these indicators, we need a database. So we have a database with some data for the main construction products and also basic inputs like electricity and fuels. Then we have a calculator to build the life cycle inventory and calculate these indicators from cradle to gate. If the data if the person wants to publish the data, there is a review workflow for a third-party independent verification of the numbers and the underlying information. Then once it's published, there is a search interface that I will quickly show you. And the system can also issue automatic simplified APDs in PDF files. So the data of this first version contains 86 construction products from 12 categories of construction materials, which are shown there. And these products correspond to 90% of the mass of construction materials sold here in Brazil. So it covers a high share of the embodied carbon of buildings as well. And we also have some basic information like electricity supply from the national grid, fuels, transportation processes, waste disposal, and water supply. All these data are based on generic data from previous data collection initiatives and literature here in Brazil. But the system is now prepared to receive manufacturer-specific information, but it doesn't have any manufacturer-specific information yet. So I will just switch to the system itself to show you how it looks like. So this is the interface of SIDAC. It was developed in Portuguese, but it's also available in English and Spanish, parts of it. So we have a landing page that can be accessed on sidac.org.br. This landing page contains some basic information. And we also have some videos about how to use the system to guide the user in the first contact. We have a technical content part here with the methodology of the system that has been reviewed by a scientific committee composed of experts from Brazil and also from abroad. And we also have our data collection reports here available for consultation. They're all available in Portuguese. And this is the search interface. So you can look for some product, let's say concrete block. You can type in here the name, or you can filter by the categories. So let's take this type of block here. So once we open, there is the reference unit to which the indicators are expressed. So it's per unit of block. And here you have the cradle to gate indicators, so CO2 emission and primary energy demand. So for instance, for this block, we emit something like 0.36 to 0.73 kilograms of CO2 per unit of block. We also have it in graphical representation. And you can see that we have a range here because it's generic data. So we account for the possible variation in terms of product composition, on production processes, etc. And for the generic data, we also make available the detailed information about the process and the life cycle inventory that generated that indicator. And just to finish here, let me show you quickly how the calculator of the system works. So you must be logged in, but it's also freely available. Even you, if you want, can test it. So let's create a very simple product here. Let's say concrete. We have to create the process inventory with the inputs and outputs, like in an OCA. So let's take here cement. This type of cement here, sand, and stone. So, and let's also take some water. So we add everything we need to do this concrete and also the product that we are producing. So it's concrete, and we are talking about 1 cubic meter. And then we put the quantities of each raw material, like, let's say it's like this. This quantity is per cubic meter of concrete. And we can also add the transportation to the ready-mix concrete plant, for instance. So let's say cement from 300 kilometers away. You can do this also for the other materials. And once you save it, the system automatically calculates the cradle-to-gate indicators. So they are shown here. So for this type of concrete, this is the range of CO2 emission and the primary energy demand. And also the average energy composition between renewable and non-renewable sources. And now this product is saved here, and I can modify it if I want. And then if I were a manufacturer, I could also forward it to the review, and it would be all done online. So back to my presentation. It's important to mention that the CDAC was developed, it was commissioned by the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy, so it's a public system. It's coordinated by the Brazilian Council for Sustainable Construction, and it was developed by a consortium of the Brazilian universities and research institutes and a local software developer. We had the support of several committees, so an executive committee to follow up the project, the scientific committee that reviewed our methodology, and also an industry committee to ensure that the system would fit industry expectations. And it was funded by the European Union and Germany within the International Climate Initiative. So our next steps here in Brazil is to develop more the materials part, so increase the diversity of generic data in CDAC, because we do not have all materials there, and also include manufacturer-specific data starting this year. And now that we have the data for the materials, we can evolve to the building level. So it's our intention to develop new tools for building assessment and even integrate with existing tools like Edge, for instance. I think it's possible. And we're also developing, working with the federal government in public policy making to include the requirement of assessing the environmental indicators of products and buildings that are parts of publicly funded initiatives. So with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you. These are my email address if you have any questions, and please access CDAC to see how it works.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you for such a wonderful, I'm particularly excited because you're talking technology, same as the last speaker that we had, where we also looked at the internet-based software platform Edge. And, this begins to bring it home when we look at what a life cycle assessment of every building product and construction material really contributes in terms of carbon, contributions and emissions to the buildings and to the built environment in general. Oh, you were going to say something, Fernanda?
No, I just clicked it by mistake, okay. Sorry.
I'm sorry about that. Okay, so thank you so much. I'm glad that you're talking technology, because in fairness, Technology, a lot of us are familiar with a lot of technological terms, at least as it is here. We work with BEAM, you're talking about digital twins, you're talking AI. So technology is what we should be looking at in terms of how to really, deal with the issue of carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, and how we can begin to disclose what we contribute because of how we build. The Edge platform is able to show you what the entire carbon contributions are in terms of the embodied carbon. But with life cycle assessment softwares like this and databases, you're also able to see how your products, your bricks, your concrete, your cement, your building materials and components, basically how it contributes. And even though technology is sometimes expensive, it takes a whole lot to put together. It's really what we should be investing in long term. And I hope that everyone here are learning a thing or two, particularly as it relates to carbon and how we can strategize, for solutions regarding carbon databases. So thank you again, Fernanda. We will still have you here to answer questions. There are a lot of questions coming in. If you haven't dropped your question, please do so in the Q&A box. So just, I see that we're running out of time, and we have, I think a last session and a few more introductions or, to do to talk about what we are also doing at the Green Building Council here in Nigeria. Like I said, the next session will be just to have a quick interpretation of what it means to really decarbonize and the built environment professional. We're going to be looking at the challenges and the opportunities that lie therein. To take this session, we'll have QS Adebowale Oyinleye, and right after that session, we'll be having our own chair of our R&D team coming to talk to us about what we're doing at the Green Building Council in terms of building our own carbon database and the research work that we're currently doing. So as an introduction for our next speaker, QS Adebowale Oyinleye is a managing partner of Project Associates, a company that offers consulting services and trainings for professionals in the built environment, where he is responsible for general project management, developing policies and advice on procurement management, change management framework, high-level contract management, risk assessment, and claims administration. He majored in quality surveyors in his bachelor's, and he also has a master's in construction management. He's had over 22 years of expertise managing commercial and consulting projects in the Nigerian market. QS Adebowale is a resource person in Projects Academy. He has a lead AP certification. He holds the FNIQS certification, which is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. He is a member of the International Society of Sustainability Professionals. He has a PMP certification, and is, of course, is a green building and sustainability professional. Please welcome QS Adebowale to take us through the challenges and opportunities around decarbonization and the built environment professional. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Yemi.
You're welcome, sir.
Yeah, please, I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can, sir.
Okay, good. All right, once again, let me say thank you for this opportunity, and especially to the organizers. So I'll quickly just run through my presentation because of time. When we're talking about decarbonization, because we're focusing on the role of professionals, the first thing we need to understand is that decarbonization actually goes beyond just talking about the buildings, because it requires the involvement of even the managerial cadre of an organization. So it's actually about what we do as an entity, whether it's government or organization, to reduce our carbon footprints. So you see that it actually cuts across just buildings, because even if you want to do anything on your building specifically and the management do not buy into it, you discover that you have a problem. And apart from the building itself, even how you run your organization also tells on how your ability to be able to lend a helping hand to the reduction of the greenhouse gases that we are talking about. So now, as a professional, you see that because of our peculiar position in that we're involved in identifying, selecting, and implementation of projects, it is very, very critical that we understand that from the very get-go, that's even at the time that you are deciding on which projects to embark on, you're already making decisions that will have an impact on the carbon footprint. So generally, by the time the design of a building is done, and then subsequently specifications of materials are done, you are apparently almost finalizing your carbon footprint on the project. So it means that if you really want to be involved as a professional and you really want to make an impact, then our drive towards decarbonization must start even before we put pen to paper. That is, even before we begin to draw a line. I'm talking about as an architect or an engineer. That means you must look at your design. The design must be able to provide some benefit towards decarbonization. If your design is not going to provide that, by the time the designs are already accepted and the project's practical work starts on site, you have little room to make any adjustments. So design, material specifications are very, very important, because as professionals, we are the ones that sit on this table to make these decisions. So we must be able to provide value to our stakeholders, whether it's our organization or probably we have a private client. We must be able to provide value in terms of design and the specification of materials. It is said that about 90% of the room to make changes concerning decarbonization is already decided by the time you do your design and your material specifications. I'm glad that the speaker, giving us the Brazilian perspective, was able to show that the materials contributed a lot to the greenhouse gas emissions on a particular building. And what are the challenges now? Given that we know what our roles are, what are the challenges? I think the very first one, which is the short-term one in any case, is that decarbonization it's likely to have an additional first cost. Likely to have, because when we are looking at sourcing for materials that actually have a higher rate of return in terms of life cycle, it might be more expensive in the first instance. However, over time, it is able to repay even its initial cost. So that is one of the challenges that we'll have when you are dealing with maybe your stakeholders, your investors, when they find out that they might have to spend more at the onset. Some of them might not be willing to do that. And that's one of the major challenges when it comes to decarbonization. And then secondly, capacity and awareness. Capacity as professionals. We have the competence, do we have the capacity to provide what is needed and what can convince even our stakeholders and our investors? Because the investor, the stakeholder himself, might not be aware of even some of these things that we are talking about. As professionals, we are using the word decarbonization. Some of them, you really need to sit down to explain to them, what are you talking about? Green building, what does it really entail? Because there are people that have a perceived mindset that when you're talking about green building, decarbonization, that means they have to spend more. That might be true in the short term, but in the long run, they are going to save money. And then, of course, what other challenge do we have? Transition to a carbon efficient method and materials. We are used to some particular kind of materials. For example, in Nigeria, when you're talking about buildings, almost everybody will just be talking about using concrete, block work, and all that. But are there other materials that we can use? Definitely there are other materials. But how do we transition to those other materials? How do we transition from the methods that we're used to newer methods or different methods, as the case may be, that might give us what we actually need when we're talking about decarbonization? And then we also need to be careful about making goals that are realistic and achievable is very, very important, because some stakeholders get disenfranchised when probably they are told that we are going to achieve so and so if we do this. But unfortunately, even after doing some of those things, they don't get to what the goal that they were told. So we must be realistic. We must set goals that are achievable. And then, of course, very, very key is the challenge of the regulatory landscape. What are the regulations in place where we are doing or we are building this particular project? What are the regulations? Are there regulations that actually help? Are there regulations that are even against decarbonization? When we're also talking about regulation, we also need to know that are there policies in place that aid decarbonization? Or are there policies in place that are actually against you adopting a greener or an efficient building? So these are things that we need to take note of. And then, of course, there are inadequate current incentives for decarbonization. I remember sometimes ago, somebody was sharing that there are some banks, they were using particularly some banks, I think it was Colombia or so, that if we are embarking on a green building, when you go for a loan, you have some incentives, probably the interest rate is lower and all that. So do we have incentives? These are challenges that could significantly negate any attempt to decarbonize. And then, of course, when we are going technical now, is that there are some inconsistencies with respect to the basic definitions that are being used in reference to carbon, net zero carbon terminologies, and so on and so forth. Some would say net zero is achieving this, another might say net zero is achieving that. So there are some small inconsistencies, but I think there's an organization in the UK, Low Energy Transition Initiative, I think, that are trying to harmonize some of these definitions. They actually have a policy document to that effect, so that to harmonize these seeming differences in basic definitions. So when we haven't spoken about the challenges, what about the opportunities? It's not all negative. There are opportunities that are available for us as professionals. If a professional is needed at the very onset, that means there is an opportunity for a professional to get involved. But you see, for you to be involved, it's not only just looking about buildings like I mentioned, you must also perceive it as an ESG issue, a strategic opportunity to engage with other stakeholders. No one professional can embark on decarbonization alone. It requires a collective effort. Everybody needs to be involved, because ultimately, what is going to make it attractive to a stakeholder is that you are reducing the cost of construction, or you are reducing the cost of maintenance, or improving the quality of life, or improving the environmental performance of your building, or enhancing the economic performance of your building, and of course, improving perceived social value. All these things are important. Those are the things that will help propel the opportunities that we have as a professional. The diagram that we have on this slide shows consumer behavior, technology, and regulation. Consumer behavior necessarily talks about the stakeholders. Technology, what is the technology available where you are, and what about the regulations that are available? The interplay between these three is actually what defines or what actually shows the opportunities that are available in your own local markets. So it changes from market to market depending on the interplay between these three basic aspects of the decarbonization process. Now, there are some rules that are available for us as professionals, but I would like to just quickly state that when we're talking about decarbonization or greenhouse gas emissions, the simplest level for us to understand what it actually entails is that we need to first of all know the scope of what we are calculating. The scope of what we are calculating. And number two, we need to be able to quantify the material, the quantity of material that is going to be required, and of course, the emission factor of the material. It is these three that comes together to help you to know what is the level of carbon that you are actually emitting, whether embodied carbon or the operational carbon, whole life carbon, as a matter of fact. Some of the standards that are used at the EN 15804, the ISO 21930, and then some of the bodies that provide database for those that want to do some of this competition, maybe the ICE, and then of course the EPD databases from Green Book Live. You can have access to some of the data you will need in order to be able to do this. And of course, ultimately, we'll be talking about doing a life cycle assessment. Now, what are the career opportunities? According to the Canadian Institute of Energy Training, there are different opportunities that are available. You can be a climate change or decarbonization manager. You can also be an ESG manager. You can also go to become even an energy engineer or specialist, or a sustainability manager. You can decide on any one of these. These are all roles that come into play when we're talking about decarbonization. And of course, at the bottom of it all is that you are able to carry out a life cycle assessment, because that is what will be able to bring out the whole life carbon footprint of your project. I think with this, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. I was just taking a lot of notes. Thank you so much. I believe that, particularly when you come on a webinar like such as this one, everybody is wondering, oh, how does this relate to me? How is this practical? How do I, gain from this? And Kiwa Sadibali has been able to explain extensively to us everything that we need to know as it pertains to the opportunities that lie, in this sector. It's talked about professional contributions. It's talked about the challenges, the upfront costs, the things that we usually would, begin to look at and be a bit worried, I must say, that how can we achieve this? Is looked at, awareness is spoken extensively about awareness. And I think that's why we're having this webinar, so that we can all be aware of what the policy says, what are the incentives that are available, what are the regulations that, that support what we're trying to discuss. It spoke about being realistic, transitioning, in seeking alternatives, which is also very key. He related this also to incentives, talking about carbon credit, like Kwanzaa had mentioned earlier, sustainable financing, which I know that the World GBC is also working on. And it's just not all challenges. There are also the good parts, like I mentioned earlier, the big foods, the low-hanging ones, and of course the bigger rewards. How you can position yourself in this sector, in the environmental, social, and governance sector, how you can collaborate. That's why we're on this platform. You can reach out to people, you can speak to the people here if you're thinking of diversifying and working in the area of life cycle assessment, carbon database, decarbonization, sustainability. Take up your role as a professional. Thank you so much, sir, for that session. So we'll take some questions that we have on the Q&A chat box, and thereafter would have the president of the Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors speak to us briefly, and then after that we'll take Professor Abdul Amin Mambo. Like I mentioned, he's the chair of the research team at the Green Building Council, working on our carbon database and how we are looking at working in the African context or the Nigerian context in developing our own carbon database. So there are a couple of questions here that I'll take. I see one which I believe, I don't know if Victoria is still here, what she had mentioned that she would like to respond to. Is Victoria still on board? Oh, yes. Okay, so I'll just read the question. It's from Ayondeji, and it says, how realistic is the concept of green buildings in Nigeria, given that affordable housing is still an unsolved issue? It says, I also think that the targets for the adoption of green buildings, I think the speaker mentioned 2030 for new buildings and 2050 for all buildings, including renovations, should be reviewed on a region basis. Developed countries will be able to make a switch, whilst developing countries might not be able to comply due to the different peculiarities and realities. There's a lot of questions in that. So Victoria, please, can you answer that very briefly for us?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for picking that up. Well, firstly, I wanted to just say that, these dates that we've come up with are based on remaining carbon budgets, and it simply isn't really anymore a question of whether or not we need to be doing it. We need to be focusing on the how, and I'm so thrilled that your panelists today have been able to show some really tangible examples of that. First of all, I wanted to say that the affordable, we have an affordable housing question. We have a report coming out soon about affordable and attainable housing, achieving affordable and attainable housing that is more sustainable. So I really would encourage you to keep an eye out for that. And I also wanted to mention that, this panel today is called Staying Relevant in the Decarbonization Agenda, right? This is all about the choices that we have to make today in order to enable us to achieve more sustainable built environments. And sometimes when we talk about net zero, it's easy to talk about tech, it's easy to talk about things that sound kind of expensive, but we also know that some of the simplest forms that we can apply to building design around, passive design, natural ventilation, using natural daylight, there's lots of ways that you can achieve net zero at not an increased premium today. And so we're also seeing that one of the biggest challenges in, let's say, North America and Europe is an existing housing stock that is not coping well with the current changes in climate today. So by not building to net zero, or at least net zero ready, which is ensuring that our buildings meet all of the things that all our speakers have talked about, that they're energy efficient, that the energy source is considered, and that embodied carbon is being reduced, and built within a sustainable and attainable way, which includes the finances. And we know that there's finance available for projects that want to seek those targets. That it also means that we're not locking in design decisions that are going to have to be renovated in the future in order to reach those 2050 targets. So the best thing that we can say is that we have to set these sorts of targets to challenge industry on how we can build better. And the good news is that there's lots of inexpensive ways to do that, as we've heard from some of our speakers. So I would really challenge you to sort of turn this challenge into an opportunity, I suppose.
Hi, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I trust you were able to do justice to that. Mr. Anyodele, I hope you are particularly satisfied with the response and the feedback. You can always continue to discuss with us. So I'll take another question here. I'm going to Mr. Kwanzaa. Somebody had asked, considering the cost of zero carbon certification, can an individual get it? Can you just shed some light on that?
Yeah, so the zero carbon certification is supposed to be for buildings. So yes, it's possible. I mean, like we've seen in other parts of the world, like I said in my presentation, we haven't gotten any project in Africa getting the EDGE zero carbon certification yet. However, EDGE has been set up such that it's able to guide the project to reach that particular target by, first of all, being able to use passive measures, just like Victoria did mention, very passive and simple measures to be able to get the project to be as efficient as possible and achieve the EDGE advanced status. And then from there, you can gradually install your renewables or carbon offset to get to that level. I would say you may think it's very expensive from the get-go, but then in the long term, you're able to see the benefit. And it's why the software and the EDGE software becomes very important here, because as a client, you are able to do your own assessment and then see what the incremental cost is. you're able to see what the benefits for going green or going all the way to net zero is going to be. What are the savings you are going to be getting in utility savings and all of that. And then compare that to the incremental cost and then see the payback period. And you're able to make your own decision. So basically what EDGE tries to do is to allow you to make your own decision. I mean, look at the numbers yourselves and then make a decision as to if it makes sense for you to take this important step.
Thank you, Mr. Kwanzaa. I believe you shared. So, of course, that's why the several steps, of course, levels of certification to the on the EDGE platform. You can start from the basic one to the next one, and then you get to the next one. So you can start small, and then you can make the decision, like Mr. Kwanzaa had said. So this question will go to Fernanda Silva. You had indicated you want to answer this. It's from Justice Okechukwu, and it says, it reads, cement and concrete, which is dominant building materials in Nigeria, contributing anything as regards carbon footprint? If yes, to what degree? And which readily available materials can be used to substitute them? That's a very fantastic question. Please, over to you, Fernanda.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's quite similar here in Brazil. We use a lot of concrete and cement for structures and mortars, concrete blocks, etc. So it's not easy to phase them out. And they contribute significantly to the total embodied emissions of buildings, I would say at least to 50%, but in some cases it reaches 70 or 80% of the total embodied carbon of buildings. I mean, there are spaces for replacement. Here we have been talking a lot about wood construction, but it also has some challenges like technical ones, such as fire safety and also durability. But before thinking about material substitution, I would recommend looking at supplier selection, because when we look at the carbon footprint of specific materials, we see that if you choose the right supplier, this can already lead to a decarbonization. So you have suppliers with high footprint and suppliers with low footprint. And it doesn't require that much effort of changing the whole design. This is something that's easier to implement in the short term. So I think this is something that we should look for to make supplier selection based on environmental indicators. And it's a point to start before we totally substitute materials.
Thank you. I think, yeah, the first point also, of course, to start is to research what is available, what are you trying to achieve while you're designing. I know Victoria had mentioned something about, strategies that you can also incorporate into, your design, rather than looking at replacement or substitution as the first solution. Consider other strategies that can work and help you achieve lower carbon footprint or lower greenhouse gas emissions. So for this session, I want to take a last question, and I want Kiwes Adebowale Unyile to answer that. This question came in from Abdulaziz Aliu, and it says, sorry, what happened? Just disappeared. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the question is, how radical can the approach for a net zero carbon adoption be for developing countries like Nigeria, given the economic projections and being that governments are the major subscribers of these services?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I was actually attempting to write an answer to him, but then I think what I would say is, first of all, I'm not talking about the radical now. I'm looking more at an incremental approach towards decarbonization. First of all, because of the peculiarity of our market, and of course, also because of the level of awareness and competence that has been developed among professionals. Because I've always advocated that the professionals must first of all scale up before they can also scale up the industry. So if the professionals have not done that, it will be difficult for that change to come. But thank God, the Green Building Council in Nigeria is actually doing a lot of advocacy And while we might think the government will drive the process, I think it's the private sector professionals, as we are, even on this platform now, that must be willing to make the sacrifice and drive this process. When the benefits begin to show, I believe the government is going to follow suit. But then I always say that anything that you want the government to buy into, you must be able to provide facts and figures. If you don't have that, it will be difficult for you to, even when you have facts and figures, it's difficult to even to change their opinion. So talk less of when you don't have facts and figures. So I believe as professionals, we need to develop the ability to bring up the facts and figures. And then if we begin to take up space in the public media, I think the government will eventually follow suit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So just so as we begin to wrap up, I see a lot of people have their hands raised. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box, please, so that we also want to do this within the ambit of the time that we are set to do this. Very quickly, I'm going to bring on board the the president of the FNIQS, the Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors, QS, Michael Olayemi Shonubi. He will just be giving us a brief talk on what the discuss for this evening about strategizing for decarbonization on the built environment. I'm just going to run briefly through his bio, and then QS Shonubi would come on board. QS Shonubi graduated from the University of Ife, now Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, with a BSc in Quantity Surveying. Is a corporate member of the FNIQS, and of course, is the current president of the Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. He was admitted into the prestigious Institute of Directors in Nigeria in March 2024. He has over 30-year career path, which cuts across a wide range of projects in infrastructure, residential, commercial, the wide spectrum. Aside from traditional quantity surveying services, he also offers project monitoring, due diligence consulting services for financial institutions. He's held several positions, and is of course members to a lot of prestigious organizations. Please join me as we welcome the president of the FNIQS this evening to just speak with us very briefly before we go on to take what we're doing at the GBCN from Professor Abdul Hamid Mambo. Thank you, sir. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Yemi, for the wonderful way you have conducted this webinar. And let me also thank the GBC Nigeria for this opportunity to collaborate on this webinar, as well as thank all the resource persons, from our own QS Adibo Alewile to Fernanda to Victoria, and Professor Mambo, even though we've not had him yet, and then Dennis Kwanzaa, who I met sometime last year at an affordable conference organized by IFC in the hotel. And what led to this collaboration was we felt that, look, it's about time for the professionals in Nigeria to get actively involved in this net zero and the green building. For those who probably have been following the news, they will realize that the outgoing vice president, for instance, in the last 2 weeks has been talking about this same thing, that is net zero, the COP, because incidentally, the Nigerian government also signed up to COP 27 in Egypt, which incidentally was a follow-up to our own Vienna conference, which theme then was on climate change. And for all of us, it is important that being built environment professionals, we should be concerned about our environment. And the whole reduction of carbon emission is all about protecting our environment, which we are supposed to be the professionals in charge. We are supposed to plan and make sure that this environment is livable for all the inhabitants. And one of the areas that have been found out that we can make this environment livable is by ensuring that we are able to reduce our carbon footprint. Incidentally, some of the materials that created this emission as a result of human activities. So how can we go further to reduce this? And I think this is why I believe this webinar is important. And there will be a follow-up, because before this webinar, I had some conversation with the GBC, that's Kira Dajuma Waniko, about organizing some certification courses. But I also thought we need to first create an awareness of where we should be. Because it's only when people are aware of what exactly we are talking about. When you're talking about green building, we are talking about net zero, we are talking about carbon emission, we are talking about decarbonization. Then it becomes a lot easier when you ask somebody to come and get certified as a professional, either to organize and to undertake audits, carbon audits, and so on. But because if you don't understand what we are talking about, then you probably will not appreciate why you need to get certified. Now, the other time, Kira Adeboale was talking about incentives. Yes, under the ESG funds, there are some funds. For instance, if we are going to access green bonds, then the project will only go to those projects that have been shown that have, show some green building, have maybe passed green building criteria, or has some net zero in the implementation and in the planning. So if we have all that in place, we professionals who are the built environment professionals, who are supposed to plan and help implement both the design as well as the construction, we should be at the forefront of pushing this agenda. And so on that note, I think I want to once again thank the Green Building Council of Nigeria for partnering with us, and we look forward to more collaboration in expanding the scope of the decarbonization in Nigeria, as well as talking to the government. Thank you all very much for all the participants that are joining. The last time I checked, I think we have 140 participants, but I think people come in and go. So I want to thank all that have joined in and have been asked, those that have asked salient questions. I thank everyone. Thank you all for being here. God bless you.
Thank you very much, President Shonubi. Like you said, the discourse doesn't end here. It's an ongoing concern, and it's key, because you might look at it that it doesn't. How does this relate to what is happening in Nigeria? But if you want to key yourself into the future of being relevant in the built environment, you need to key into ESGs, like you had mentioned. They're building projects where you work on, where there's facility, where there's financing, where you have access to green bonds. These are platforms where you can get to hear things like that. And then you also, re-engineered, your thought process is wired differently, and you begin to look at other prospects that are possible in this sector. Again, thank you so much, sir, for being part of this good process. Thank you for collaborating with the GBCN. And again, thank you for everyone who has stayed till this time. We don't want to keep you longer than we had said. Very quickly, I am going to take on Professor Abdul-Hamid Mambo. I'll just do a quick introduction of him, and then he will just speak to us briefly about what we're doing at the GBCN concerning data research, data carbon research database. And then after, we'll take a parting, maybe 30 seconds parting words from each of our speakers. I hope they're still here, and then we can close the session. If we have a minute or two, we will try to answer questions that we have not yet answered, but I know some of our panelists are doing justice to that in the Q&A session. There are also links that have been dropped in the Q&A box. Please go there, copy the links. We'll share the transcript of this meeting, but please copy the links, go back, do some further reading about what we're doing and what we're talking about, and then what area you should actually position yourself, particularly as regarding carbon, sustainability, green buildings, ESG processes, and sustainable financing as well. So Professor Abdul-Hamid Mambo is a professor and head of the Department of Civil Engineering at the Now University of Nigeria in Abuja. He has a BSc in Civil Engineering from the Federal University in Minna, and he has a PhD. Sorry, he has a master's. I'm sorry, sir. He has a master's in building services engineering with distinction and a PhD in civil and building engineering, all from Loughborough University in the UK. He started engineering as a career in 2006. And then he's, worked with BIM Consult. He's later become a postdoctoral research associate at the university where he schooled. His research area includes sustainable infrastructure, energy efficiency, building energy management systems. He's published 2 books. So we have an author with us here. Thank you. And he's published 2 books and he's presented papers with reputable international conferences and workshops in the UK, France, Sweden, in Rwanda, in Kenya, and of course, Nigeria. Professor Abdulhamid Mambo is a fellow of the Nigerian Institute of Civil Engineers, is a fellow of the European Alliance, is a registered civil engineer with the Council of Registered Engineers in Nigeria. Please welcome Professor Abdulhamid Mambo this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Let me start by thanking the President of Green Building Council of Nigeria, together with his team, especially Architect Yemi, for drafting me into this conversation. Let me also thank the previous speakers, starting from Victoria, Dennis, Fernanda, Adebo Ali, and the rest of the other speakers. My task was cut out for me, and I'm just to bring you up to speed on what we are doing here in Nigeria concerning carbon database. Maybe before I go into what we're doing, it is important for me to mention why it is important for us to have a carbon database for Nigeria. The built environment carbon database in Nigeria is essential to the country's goal of reducing carbon emission. Nigeria is undergoing rapid urbanization. I think it has one of the highest urbanization rates in the world. And therefore, it becomes very essential to reduce the carbon footprint of its built environment as a crucial component for reducing overall emission or becoming decarbonized. A strong built environment carbon data strategy would enable authorities to identify the sources of emission and measure the effectiveness of carbon reduction initiative. It is said that if you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So if we want to effectively manage our carbon emissions, then we definitely have to be able to measure. Also, a built environment carbon database in Nigeria will serve as an invaluable tool for improving the efficiency and sustainability of the country's infrastructure. By tracking sources of emission, authorities can identify opportunities to develop more energy efficient buildings and other improvements that reduce the carbon footprint of the built environment. For this and many other reasons that maybe time will not permit me to mention, we started the effort to develop the built environment carbon database for Nigeria as an important step toward promoting sustainability in the built environment. We are currently working to compile the database in order to support informed decision-making, informed sustainable strategies, and to develop approaches to mitigate climate change in the built environment. So while we are doing this, what have we done? We have constituted a multidisciplinary or multi-sector sectoral committee, steering committee on this particular